Sir, you're clearly too old and frail to be traveling alone. I can't let you board this flight. It's a liability issue. The TSA agent sneered, loud enough for the entire security line to hear. Colonel William Bill Anderson, 78, recipient of the Medal of Honor, gripped his cane tighter, his weathered face flushing with humiliation. I've flown to 43 countries, son. I think I can manage to Dallas. The agent's radio crackled. We've got a situation with an elderly passenger making a scene, need backup. 15 minutes later, as Colonel Anderson sat dejected on a bench, the airport terminal suddenly went completely silent. The distinct sound of military boots on tile echoed through the concourse, and every head turned. Colonel William Bill Anderson was not a man who invited pity. At 78 years old, his posture remained remarkably straight despite the titanium hip and reconstructed spine souvenirs from a helicopter crash in the highlands of Vietnam. His face bore the dignified weathering of a life lived outdoors. And in service, deep creases around keen gray eyes that still assessed rooms with tactical precision, and a strong jawline now softened slightly with age but no less determined. Today, he walked with a hand-carved oak cane, not out of vanity but necessity. The cane had been a gift from his grandson, who had carved it from a fallen oak on the family ranch, polished to a warm glow and topped with a Marine Corps emblem, inlaid in brass. Bill used it mainly on days when his hip protested too much, or when standing for long periods, as airport security lines inevitably required. He wore neatly pressed khaki slacks, a blue button-down shirt with a discreet American flag pin on the collar, and a lightweight navy blazer that concealed the slight stoop of his shoulders. His white hair was trimmed in the same military precise cut he'd worn for 50 years. And despite the early hour and the stress of travel, he was freshly shaved and impeccably groomed. Bill Anderson had learned long ago that dignity was often the only thing a man could control in undignified situations. The Atlanta International Airport sprawled around him like a small city, bustling with early morning travelers rushing to gates, harried parents corralling sleepy children, and business travelers already deep in phone conversations. Bill had arrived 3 hours early for his flight, partially out of military habit and partially because these days his body moved at its own deliberate pace. His destination was Dallas, where his first great-grandchild, little Emma, would be celebrating her first birthday. It wasn't a journey he took lightly. Since Martha's passing 2 years ago, he had limited his travel, finding the logistics increasingly taxing. But for Emma, with her infectious giggle and Martha's eyes, he would endure any discomfort. The security line snaked forward slowly, a labyrinth of tension and impatience. Bill watched as younger travelers sighed dramatically, checked watches, and shifted from foot to foot as if their restlessness could somehow accelerate the process. He maintained his stillness, conserving energy, observing old habits. When he finally reached the front of the line, he carefully placed his small carry-on bag on the conveyor belt. He had packed meticulously, bringing only necessities and the carefully wrapped gift for Emma, a small handcrafted wooden music box that played "You Are My Sunshine," Martha's favorite lullaby. "Sir, you'll need to remove your shoes, belt, and any items in your pockets," the young TSA agent instructed without looking up from her screen. "Yes, ma'am," Bill replied courteously, though the process of removing his shoes would be neither quick nor dignified with his hip. He began to lower himself carefully to a nearby bench. "Sir, please proceed to the screening area first," the agent said, gesturing impatiently. "I'll need to sit to remove my shoes," Bill explained calmly. "My hip doesn't allow me to balance on one foot anymore." The agent's expression flickered between annoyance and reluctant accommodation. "Fine, but please hurry. We have a line." Bill nodded, easing himself down. The simple act of untying and removing his shoes took nearly a minute and eternity in the rushed choreography of airport security. He could feel impatient gazes boring into his back, could almost hear the unspoken thoughts. Why didn't he prepare better? Why is he traveling alone at his age? Shoes finally removed, he rose carefully, using his cane for support, and made his way to the body scanner. Another agent, a heavy-set man with Peters on his nameplate and a face set in the permanent scowl of someone who had long ago stopped finding satisfaction in his work, gestured abruptly. "Cane goes through the X-ray," he said. "I understand," Bill replied, "but I'll need assistance to walk without it." Peters sighed dramatically. "Johnson, we need assistance," he called out, as if Bill had requested something extraordinarily inconvenient rather than a basic accommodation. A third agent approached, a young woman whose nameplate read Rodriguez. Her face showed something the others lacked: a basic human empathy. "I'll help you, sir," she said, offering her arm. "Thank you, miss," Bill said, relinquishing his cane to the X-ray belt and accepting her support. The simple kindness was almost startling amid the mechanical processing of human bodies. He stepped into the scanner, arms raised as instructed. Ignoring the protest from his shoulder, another old war injury that flared in damp weather or when held in unnatural positions. "Please step back and try again," Peters instructed after the first scan. "You moved." "I apologize," Bill said, though he had stood as still as his body would allow. The slight tremor in his right hand, a souvenir from nerve damage, was beyond his control. He tried again, concentrating on absolute stillness, a skill he had once used to remain undetected in jungle operations. This time the scanner completed its assessment, but Peters was frowning at the screen. "I'm showing abnormalities around your hip and spine. You'll need a pat-down." Bill nodded, unsurprised. His titanium hip and the metal pins in his spine always triggered the scanners. "I have artificial joints and surgical hardware," he explained. "I should have mentioned it earlier." "Arms out, feet apart," Peters instructed, his tone making it clear that Bill's explanation was irrelevant to the procedure. Agent Rodriguez returned with his cane, but was quickly redirected by Peters. "I've got this. Go help at lane 3. The pat-down was thorough and impersonal. Bill stood stoically, his face impassive, though being touched by strangers was something he had never grown comfortable with after the war. Some aversion stayed with a man. "What's your final destination today?" Peters asked, though his tone suggested the question was procedural rather than conversational. "Dallas," Bill replied. "My great-granddaughter's first birthday." Peters didn't acknowledge the personal detail. "Any stops between here and there?" "No, direct flight." "Traveling alone?" Peters asked, his hands moving to Bill's shoulders. "Yes." Peters paused, looking at Bill with newfound scrutiny. "How old are you, sir?" The question seemed irrelevant to security, but Bill answered anyway, 78. Peters stepped back, his expression shifting to something between concern and suspicion. "And you're traveling unaccompanied?" "Yes," Bill replied, a hint of steel entering his voice. "As I have been doing since before you were born, I imagine." The response didn't appear to please Peters, whose frown deepened. "Wait here," he instructed, before walking over to confer with a supervisor, a tall woman with a severe bun and an even more severe expression. Bill stood patiently, though he was acutely aware of the time passing. His flight wasn't for another hour and a half, but he preferred to reach his gate with ample time. Martha had always teased him about his insistence on arriving early, calling it his hurry-up-and-wait philosophy. The memory brought a slight smile to his face. The smile faded as Peters returned with the supervisor, whose nameplate identified her as Walsh. "Sir," Walsh began, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Agent Peters has expressed some concerns about your fitness to travel unaccompanied." Bill blinked, momentarily confused. "My fitness?" "Yes, given your age and observed mobility issues. We have concerns about your ability to safely navigate the airport and flight without assistance." It's a matter of airline liability and passenger safety. The words landed like small, precise blows. Bill had faced many indignities in his life, the horrors of war, the slow betrayal of his aging body, the gut-wrenching grief of burying his wife of 53 years. But this casual dismissal of his competence struck a particularly painful chord. "I assure you, I am perfectly capable of traveling independently," he said, his voice level but firm. "I've been doing so for over 60 years, including multiple international flights just last year." Welsh's expression remained unmoved. "Nevertheless, our observations today indicate potential issues. You had difficulty removing your shoes, maintaining balance, and you require a mobility aid. These factors suggest you may need a travel companion. For your safety." Bill felt heat rising in his chest, not embarrassment now, but a slow burning anger. "Are you suggesting I cannot board my flight?" "I'm suggesting you consider rescheduling with proper assistance arrangements," Walsh replied. "We can have you speak with the airline about their policies for passengers who may require special handling." The phrase special handling hung in the air, clinical and dehumanizing. Bill straightened his back, ignoring the familiar twinge of pain, and met Walsh's gaze directly. "I am a retired Marine Corps colonel," he said quietly. "I have commanded men in 3 conflicts, survived 2 helicopter crashes, and earned the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. I believe I can manage to board an airplane and sit in a seat for 2 hours without supervision." The words were delivered without drama or raised voice, but something in his tone caused Walsh to blink, her professional veneer momentarily cracking. Peters, however, seemed unmoved and perhaps even irritated by Bill's response. "Sir, your military service, while appreciated, isn't relevant to current safety protocols. The fact is, you're clearly too old and frail to be traveling alone. I can't let you board this flight. It's a liability issue." The statement, delivered loudly, enough to be heard by nearby travelers, sent a ripple of uncomfortable silence through the immediate area. Several passengers glanced over, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort to outright disapproval. Though whether of Bill or the TSA agent, it wasn't clear. Bill felt a flush of humiliation rise from his collar. In all his years, through combat and capture, through the loss of friends and eventually his beloved Martha, he had maintained his dignity. To have it stripped away so casually, so publicly, by someone who knew nothing of his life or capabilities, was almost physically painful. "I would like to speak to your supervisor," Bill said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath. "I am the supervisor on duty," Walsh replied, "and I support Agent Peters' assessment. This is a matter of airline policy and passenger safety, not personal preference." Bill's hand tightened on his cane, the wood warm and familiar against his palm. He thought of Emma waiting in Dallas, of the promise he'd made to be there. He thought of Martha, who would have handled this situation with the perfect blend of charm and steely resolve that had made her such a formidable military wife for over 5 decades. "Then I would like to speak to someone from the airline," he said. "This is not a TSA matter, but an airline policy issue, as you've stated." Walsh hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Wait here," she instructed, as if Bill had any choice in the matter. Stranded as he was in the security area without his belongings, which still sat in bins on the conveyor belt. As Walsh walked away, Peters remained, standing uncomfortably close, as if Bill might attempt to flee. The nearby passengers continued to process through security, some averting their eyes from the uncomfortable scene, others watching with undisguised curiosity. A young man in business attire, who had been a few people behind Bill in line, approached cautiously. "Excuse me," he said to Peters, "but is there a problem here? This gentleman doesn't seem to be presenting any security threat." Peters turned, his expression hardening. "This is an official TSA matter, sir. Please continue to your gate." The businessman hesitated, looking at Bill with concern, Are you okay, sir? Do you need any help? Before Bill could respond, Peters stepped between them. Sir, interfering with TSA procedures is a federal offense. Please move along immediately. The young man raised his hands in a placating gesture and backed away, though his troubled expression suggested the matter didn't sit right with him. Bill stood silently, conserving his energy and considering his options. He had faced worse obstacles than an overzealous TSA agent, much worse. This was merely bureaucratic nonsense, not life or death. And yet, the public humiliation, the questioning of his basic competence, cut deep in a way that physical challenges never had. After what seemed an interminable wait, Walsh returned with an airline representative, a middle-aged woman in a crisp uniform whose name tag read Carson. Colonel Anderson? She asked, approaching with a professional smile. I'm Diane Carson, Customer Service Manager for Southwest. I understand there's some concern about your travel arrangements today. Her tone was respectful, which Bill appreciated after the clinical assessment from the TSA agents. There seems to be confusion about my ability to travel independently, he replied. I assure you, I am fully capable. Carson glanced at Walsh, then back to Bill. Our policy does not restrict solo travel based on age, she said carefully. However, we do need to ensure all passengers can safely evacuate in an emergency without assistance. Would you have any difficulty following emergency procedures if necessary? No more than most of your passengers who've had a couple of in-flight cocktails, Bill replied dryly. A flicker of amusement crossed Carson's face before she composed herself. Colonel, would you be willing to accept pre-boarding assistance to your seat? That might address some of the concerns being raised. It was a compromise, and while it wasn't ideal, Bill had never needed special treatment and didn't want to start now. It would get him on the plane to Dallas. To Emma, that would be acceptable, he agreed. Walsh frowned. Ms. Carson, we have observed significant mobility issues that suggest. Thank you for your input. Carson interrupted smoothly. As this is ultimately an airline decision, we'll proceed with pre-boarding assistance. Colonel Anderson's military ID and regular travel history are sufficient assurance for our purposes. Peters looked like he wanted to object further, but seemed to recognize he was overruled. With visible reluctance, he stepped aside. Now, Carson continued, if you'll allow me to escort you to retrieve your belongings and then to your gate, Colonel. Your flight begins boarding in 45 minutes. Bill nodded, relief washing through him. Thank you, Miss Carson. As they moved toward the conveyor to collect his shoes and carry-on, Peters made one final comment, his voice low but clear. Sir, you're clearly too old and frail to be traveling alone. I can't let you board this flight. It's a liability issue. Carson turned sharply. Excuse me, Agent Peters. Peters' radio crackled before he could respond. We've got a situation with an elderly passenger making a scene. Need backup. Bill realized with a jolt that the elderly passenger in question was himself, and that Peters had called for reinforcements before the discussion had even properly begun, a disturbing indication of the agent's predetermined conclusion. Carson's expression hardened. I'll be speaking with your supervisor, your actual supervisor, not Agent Walsh, about this incident, she said crisply. Colonel Anderson has been nothing but cooperative, and this characterization is completely inappropriate. Peters shrugged, unrepentant. Just following protocol for passenger safety. Bill collected his shoes and sat to put them on, the process no quicker than it had been earlier, but somehow less humiliating with Carson running interference. As he tied his laces, he noticed the young businessman from earlier standing nearby, typing rapidly on his phone. Their eyes met briefly, and the young man gave a small nod before turning away. 15 minutes later, as Colonel Anderson sat dejected on a bench near his gate, gathering his thoughts after the ordeal, the airport terminal suddenly went completely silent. The distinct sound of military boots on tile echoed through the concourse. and every head turned toward the source of the sound. Bill looked up, confused by the abrupt change in the airport's atmosphere. The constant background noise of announcements, conversations, and rolling luggage had ceased as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. Coming through the main concourse was a sight that made his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. A formation of Marines in dress blues, moving with the precision that only comes from thousands of hours of drill, was approaching his gate. At their head was a face he hadn't seen in nearly a decade, but would recognize anywhere: General James Harrington, now the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the highest-ranking officer in the branch. Passengers stepped back, conversations halted. Mid-sentence, even children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and fell silent. The formation moved with purpose, their destination unmistakable. They stopped precisely in front of Bill's bench, the Commandant stepping forward while the others formed a perfect line behind him. The General's face was stern, but his eyes held warmth as they fell on Bill. "Colonel William Anderson, General," Harrington said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent terminal. "On behalf of the United States Marine Corps and a grateful nation, I must apologize for the unconscionable treatment you received today." Bill struggled to process what was happening. "General Harrington," he managed, instinctively trying to rise to attention. "Please remain seated, sir," the general said, and then did something that sent a ripple of astonishment through the watching crowd. He saluted, a perfect parade ground salute offered with profound respect to a seated man, 30 years his senior. The other Marines followed suit, a wall of immaculate dress blues and white gloves raised in synchronized honor. The silence in the terminal deepened, if that were possible, into something almost reverent. "How did you?" Bill began, but the general anticipated his question. "A Marine never leaves another Marine behind, Colonel. Word travels fast when someone with your record is disrespected on American soil." He gestured subtly toward the concourse, where Bill noticed the young businessman from security standing discreetly beside a Marine Corps veteran in civilian clothes. "It seems you have advocates, sir," the general continued. "And when the Commandant's office receives multiple calls about a Medal of Honor recipient being publicly humiliated by airport security, well, I happened to be in Atlanta for a conference. Some things you handle personally." Bill felt a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude, yes, but also a touch of embarrassment at being the center of such attention. "This really isn't necessary, General. I was managing the situation." "Of course you were," General Harrington replied with the ghost of a smile. "You managed far worse in Quang Tri Province. But this isn't about necessity, Colonel. It's about respect." He turned to address the now substantial crowd of onlookers. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice projected without seeming to raise it, a skill cultivated over decades of command, "the man before you is Colonel William Anderson, United States Marine Corps, retired. At Khe Sanh, when his unit was ambushed and his commanding officer killed, then Captain Anderson assumed command while severely wounded himself. Over the next 36 hours, he coordinated a defense that saved 53 American lives, personally carried 3 injured Marines to safety under heavy fire, and called in precise airstrikes that ultimately allowed for evacuation." The general paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "For these actions, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration. Colonel Anderson went on to serve with distinction in multiple conflicts, training and mentoring generations of Marines, including myself. His leadership principles are still taught at Quantico today." Bill sat very still, uncomfortable with the recitation of actions he had never considered extraordinary, just necessary in the moment, as any Marine would have done. "This morning," the general continued, his tone sharpening, "this American hero was publicly humiliated and nearly prevented from traveling to see his great-granddaughter because someone decided he was too old and too frail to exercise the basic freedom of movement that he spent a lifetime defending. A murmur of disbelief and disapproval rippled through the crowd. "I want to be very clear," General Harrington said, his voice taking on the unmistakable edge of command, "that this treatment does not reflect the values of our nation or the respect owed to our veterans. Appropriate measures are already being implemented to address this incident at the highest levels." As if on cue, a group of airport officials and TSA administrators appeared at the periphery of the crowd, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Among them, Bill recognized Walsh and Peters, both now pale-faced and rigid. The general turned back to Bill. "Colonel Anderson, with your permission, I and these Marines would be honored to escort you to Dallas today." Bill blinked in surprise. "To Dallas?" "General, surely you have more important matters." "No, sir," General Harrington interrupted firmly. "Today, there is no more important matter than ensuring you reach your great-granddaughter's birthday celebration with the dignity and respect you've earned 1,000 times over." The terminal, which had been silent, now erupted in applause, spontaneous and heartfelt. Travelers who moments ago had been focused on their own journeys were on their feet, some wiping tears, others nodding in vigorous approval. Bill felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. Not just the weight of this morning's humiliation, but perhaps something deeper, the quiet burden of feeling increasingly invisible in a world that moved too quickly and valued youth above experience. "Well," he said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him, "I wouldn't want to disappoint little Emma." The general smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his official demeanor. "No, sir. We certainly wouldn't want that." As Bill rose carefully to his feet, the Marines adjusting their formation to accommodate his pace, he felt a profound sense of belonging that transcended the decades and changes in his life. This was the brotherhood he had entered as a young man, the bond that had sustained him through war and peace, joy and grief. The crowd parted respectfully as the unusual procession made its way toward the gate where Bill's flight would soon board. As they walked, General Harrington spoke quietly, just for Bill's ears. "You should know, Colonel, that your story has already reached the Secretary of Defense in the White House. By the time you land in Dallas, there will be new protocols in place for how veterans, particularly decorated ones, are treated at security checkpoints. Your experience today, unfortunate as it was, will prevent countless others from facing similar indignities." Bill nodded, humbled by the thought that even now, decades after his active service had ended, he could still make a difference. "Thank you, James," he said, using the general's first name for the first time, acknowledging the personal nature of this intervention. "Thank you, sir," the general replied simply, "for everything." As they approached the gate, Bill noticed something unexpected. A line of airline staff standing at attention, led by Diane Carson, who had advocated for him earlier. Beyond them, visible through the large windows, ground crew members stood in similar fashion beside the aircraft. "Your chariot awaits, Colonel," General Harrington said with a small smile. The terminal remained unusually quiet, the normal hustle of airport life temporarily suspended in recognition of something more important than schedules and connections, the acknowledgement of sacrifice, the power of respect, and the enduring strength of a man who had given everything for his country and asked for nothing in return, not even the simple dignity of traveling to his great-granddaughter's birthday without question or hindrance. As the boarding announcement came over the speakers, the gate agent's voice carried a note of unusual reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen, Southwest Airlines is honored to begin priority boarding for Marine Corps Colonel William Anderson Medal of Honor recipient and his escort." Bill turned to the general, deeply moved but also practical. "You really don't need to come all the way to Dallas, James. I'm quite capable of—" "I know you are," General Harrington interrupted gently. "But Emma should meet the Commandant of the Marine Corps on her first birthday. It's not every great-granddaughter who has such a distinguished grandfather." Bill couldn't argue with that logic. As he moved toward the jet bridge, supported by his cane and surrounded by the honor guard of active-duty Marines, he felt Martha's presence keenly, almost as if she were walking beside him. She would have loved this, not the public recognition, which she had always accepted with gracious humility, but the reminder that the values they had lived by still mattered in a changing world. The path ahead was clear now, not just to Dallas, but beyond. Bill Anderson had defended freedom on foreign shores. Today, he had stood his ground on American soil. And in both cases, he had not stood alone. Behind him, the airport terminal began to return to its normal rhythm, but something had changed. Passengers who witnessed the scene would carry the story with them, sharing it in homes and offices across the country. Some would approach veterans differently in the future, seeing beyond age and infirmity to the strength and service that defined them. And in the years to come, when travelers passed through Atlanta International Airport, they would notice a small but significant plaque near the security checkpoint, bearing the words that General Harrington had spoken that day: "Those who sacrificed to defend our freedom should never be denied the dignity of exercising them." The Southwest Airlines flight to Dallas was scheduled to depart at 9:15 a.m., and the boarding process had begun with an unexpected level of ceremony. Colonel William Anderson, accompanied by General Harrington and 2 Marine officers who would serve as his escort, approached the jet bridge amid continued applause from fellow passengers and airport staff. The airline crew had been hastily briefed on their distinguished passenger, and the captain herself had stepped out of the cockpit to greet him at the aircraft door. "Colonel Anderson, I'm Captain Sarah Reynolds," she said, offering a crisp salute. "It's an honor to have you aboard today." "Sir." Bill returned the salute with the same precision he'd maintained for decades, though his shoulder protested the movement. "The honor is mine, Captain. Thank you for accommodating all this unexpected attention." Captain Reynolds smiled warmly. "My father served in the Corps, sir. He didn't make it home from Kuwait. Having you on my aircraft means more than I can express." The simple statement, delivered without drama or excessive sentimentality, touched Bill deeply. This was the language of service members, understated, direct, acknowledging sacrifice without dwelling on it. "He'd be proud of you, Captain," Bill replied quietly. A flash of emotion crossed her face before professional composure returned. "Yes, sir, I believe he would." She gestured toward the cabin. "We've taken the liberty of upgrading you to our best available seats. If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." Bill nodded gratefully as he was escorted to his seat in the first row. General Harrington settled beside him, while the 2 Marine officers took positions across the aisle. The other passengers boarded with unusual decorum, many nodding respectfully or quietly thanking Bill for his service as they passed. As the final preparations for departure were underway, Bill noticed a commotion at the front of the aircraft. The gate agent was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with someone just out of view. After a moment, Diane Carson, the airline representative who had first intervened on his behalf, stepped onto the plane and approached the captain, who had returned to the cabin entrance for the standard pre-flight greeting. The 2 women conferred briefly, both glancing in Bill's direction several times. Finally, Captain Reynolds approached his seat. "Colonel Anderson," she began, her expression carefully neutral, "I've just been informed that there's a situation involving your earlier experience at security. Several officials are requesting to speak with you before we depart." Bill frowned slightly. "Is there a problem with my travel documentation?" "No, sir," she assured him quickly. "My understanding is that senior TSA officials and airport administration wish to formally address the incident. They're quite insistent." General Harrington straightened in his seat, his expression hardening. "Captain, is this delay necessary? Colonel Anderson has already been subjected to enough disruption today." Captain Reynolds hesitated, clearly torn between protocols and her own sense of what was right. Technically, we could refuse and proceed with our departure, but then that's what we'll do, the general stated firmly. Bill placed a weathered hand on the general's arm. No, James, let's hear them out. He turned to the captain. If it won't significantly delay the other passengers, I'm willing to speak with them briefly. Captain Reynolds nodded. Thank you. Sir, I'll inform them. She paused, then added, for what it's worth, I believe this may be to your benefit. Bill watched as she returned to the cabin door and signaled to someone in the jet bridge. A moment later, a group of 5 people boarded the aircraft, the most senior among them immediately recognizable to both Bill and General Harrington. Is that, Bill began, surprised. It is, the general confirmed quietly. Walking down the aisle was Raymond Mitchell, the Secretary of Transportation himself, followed by the TSA's regional director, the airport general manager, and 2 individuals in dark suits who remained discreetly in the background. Secretary Mitchell approached Bill's seat with a grave expression. Colonel Anderson, he said, extending his hand. I'm Ray Mitchell. I can't begin to express how disturbed I was to learn of your experience this morning. Bill shook the offered hand, momentarily at a loss for words. The presence of a cabinet secretary on a commercial aircraft to address a security incident was unprecedented in his experience. Mr. Secretary, he finally managed, this level of attention is hardly necessary. I respectfully disagree, Colonel, Mitchell replied firmly. When a Medal of Honor recipient is treated with such disrespect on American soil, it becomes a matter of national concern. He gestured to his companions. We're here to offer both a formal apology and to inform you of immediate actions being taken. The TSA regional director stepped forward, her expression a mixture of professional composure and genuine regret. Colonel Anderson, I'm Elizabeth Warren, no relation to the senator, she added with a small smile. As regional director for the TSA, I want to personally apologize for the inexcusable treatment you received today. The agents involved have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and we're implementing mandatory veteran awareness training across all checkpoints, effective immediately. Before Bill could respond, the airport general manager joined the conversation. Sir, I'm David Chun, general manager of Atlanta International. We're establishing a new veteran service office within the terminal to provide assistance and ensure nothing like this happens again. We would be honored if you would consult on its development. These rapid-fire announcements left Bill somewhat taken aback. He had expected perhaps a perfunctory apology, not sweeping policy changes or consultation offers. He glanced at General Harrington, who gave a slight nod of approval. I appreciate this swift response, Bill said carefully. Though I'm just one veteran who happened to have some well-connected advocates. He gestured toward General Harrington. There are thousands of others who serve quietly and face similar indignities without generals appearing to set things right. Secretary Mitchell nodded gravely. Precisely why this requires systemic change, not just addressing your individual case. Your experience has exposed gaps in our protocols that affect many veterans, particularly those with less visible disabilities or age-related challenges. A flight attendant approached discreetly and whispered something to Captain Reynolds, who then stepped forward. Gentlemen, I apologize, but we're now 15 minutes past our scheduled departure time. We need to close the door for takeoff. Secretary Mitchell nodded. Of course. We won't delay Colonel Anderson's journey further. He turned back to Bill. Colonel, when you return from Dallas, there will be a formal ceremony and announcement of the Anderson Protocol for veteran treatment at transportation hubs nationwide. Your legacy of service will now include improving the travel experience for generations of veterans to come. As the officials prepared to depart, Agent Peters, the TSA officer who had instigated the morning's events, was suddenly visible in the jet bridge, being escorted by 2 of the suited individuals who had accompanied the secretary. His face was ashen, his earlier arrogance replaced by evident anxiety. Secretary Mitchell followed Bill's gaze. "Agent Peters has requested the opportunity to apologize personally," he said, his tone making it clear this was not entirely voluntary. "On Peters' part, would you be willing to hear him?" Bill considered the young man, seeing not just the individual who had humiliated him, but someone who represented a broader disconnect between civilians and those who had served. "Yes," he decided, "I'll speak with him." Peters was brought to the cabin entrance, where he stood uncomfortably under the watchful eyes of everyone present. He cleared his throat twice before finding his voice. "Colonel Anderson," he began, his earlier sneering tone replaced by something closer to genuine contrition. "I want to apologize for my behavior this morning. I was wrong, completely wrong in how I treated you and in the assumptions I made." Bill studied the man's face, looking for sincerity beyond the obvious pressure he was under. "What assumptions were those, exactly?" he asked quietly. Peters shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. I saw your age and your cane and assumed you were incapable. I didn't see your service or your abilities, just limitations I projected onto you." He paused, then added with what seemed like genuine realization. "My grandfather was a Vietnam veteran. He would be ashamed of how I treated you." The mention of his grandfather appeared to affect Peters deeply, his composed apology faltering as emotion crept into his voice. "I forgot that he faces the same assumptions every day. I became the kind of person who makes his life harder, not easier." This unexpected moment of self-awareness caught Bill by surprise. He had been prepared for a mechanical apology delivered under duress, not this glimpse of genuine reflection. "Your grandfather deserves better," Bill said simply. "As do all who served. Remember that tomorrow when you return to your post, and perhaps some good will come of this unfortunate morning." Peters nodded, a mixture of shame and relief crossing his features. "Yes, sir, I will." With that, the officials disembarked, the aircraft door was secured, and the standard pre-flight announcements began. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Bill noticed passengers around him were unusually attentive, many watching him with expressions of respect or curiosity. Word had clearly spread throughout the cabin about the distinguished passenger in their midst. The flight attendant serving their section approached with special care. "Colonel Anderson, can I get you anything before takeoff? Water, coffee, juice?" "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you," he replied with a warm smile. "Black if you don't mind." "Of course, sir. And for you, General?" she asked, turning to Harrington. As the general placed his own request, Bill gazed out the window at the Atlanta skyline, giving way to clouds. He thought about how dramatically the day had shifted, from humiliation to vindication, from invisibility to recognition so intense. It was almost uncomfortable. The coffee arrived promptly, served in an actual ceramic mug rather than the standard plastic cup, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the crew's desire to show respect. Bill wrapped his fingers around the warm mug, grateful for the familiar comfort as the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude. General Harrington waited until they were level before speaking. "You handled that extremely well, Bill, especially with Peters." Bill sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Anger accomplishes little. That young man will encounter aging veterans throughout his career. Better he learn now than continue causing harm." "Always the teacher," Harrington observed with a small smile. "You were the same way at Quantico, tough but fair, demanding excellence but understanding human fallibility." Bill chuckled softly. "You make me sound like quite the philosopher. I was just trying to keep young officers alive." "You did more than that," Harrington said seriously. "You shaped the character of the corps, one officer at a time, myself included." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as the flight continued. Bill found himself drifting into memories not of combat or the dramatic moments that had earned him decorations, but of the quieter aspects of military life, The camaraderie, the shared purpose, the understanding that came from facing challenges together. He was pulled from his reverie by a soft voice from across the aisle. "Excuse me, Colonel Anderson." Bill turned to see a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, leaning slightly toward him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting recent tears. "Yes, miss," he responded gently. "I'm sorry to interrupt, sir," she said, her voice barely audible above the aircraft's ambient noise. "My name is Rebecca. My father was Marine Sergeant Daniel Mercer. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan." Bill nodded encouragingly, sensing there was more she wanted to say. She faltered, then gathered herself. "He took his own life 3 years ago. PTSD and injuries he couldn't overcome. Before today, I was angry at the military, at the system that I felt abandoned him." She met Bill's eyes directly. "Seeing how you were treated, and then how quickly everyone rallied around you, it made me wonder if my dad just didn't have the right advocates." The raw pain in her voice struck Bill deeply. He had lost too many brothers in arms to the invisible wounds of war, had attended too many funerals for men who had survived combat, only to lose the longer battle afterward. "Rebecca," he said gently, "your father's service honors him, and his struggles don't diminish that service. The system fails too many veterans, even now. But please know that your father mattered to the corps, and he matters still." General Harrington leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant Mercer's sacrifice is not forgotten, Miss Rebecca. May I ask where you're headed today?" "Dallas," she replied. "I'm starting a new job there." "Then perhaps you'd join us after we land," the general suggested. "I'd like to hear more about your father if you're willing to share." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. Yes, I'd like that. Thank you." As she settled back into her seat, visibly moved by the unexpected connection, Bill felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, the weight of responsibility that never truly left those who commanded. Even decades into retirement, the obligation to care for the men and women who served, and for the families they sometimes left behind, remained as binding as any oath. The remainder of the flight passed uneventfully. Bill dozed briefly, the events of the morning having drained him more than he cared to admit. He woke as the aircraft began its descent into Dallas, feeling the familiar pressure changes in his ears and the slight discomfort in his hip that always accompanied altitude adjustments. General Harrington had been quietly working on a tablet, but set it aside as he noticed Bill stirring. "We're about 20 minutes out," he informed him. "Your granddaughter Claire has been notified of our arrival. She'll meet us at the gate." Bill nodded gratefully. "Thank you for arranging that. I hadn't had a chance to call her with all the excitement." The general smiled. "Consider it part of the service. Besides, I've known Claire since she was a lieutenant. She'd have my stars if I delivered her father without proper notification." This brought a genuine laugh from Bill. His daughter Claire had indeed served, following in his footsteps but blazing her own trail as one of the first female combat officers in the corps. Now retired herself, she had the same determination that had characterized her military career, channeled into raising her family and managing veteran support programs in the Dallas area. As the aircraft completed its final approach, Bill felt a flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with the morning's events and everything to do with the real purpose of his journey. Little Emma, with her toothless grin and Martha's eyes, waiting to celebrate her first year of life. The landing was smooth, the taxi to the gate efficient. As the seatbelt sign dimmed and passengers began the usual rush to retrieve overhead items, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dallas Love Field. Local time is 11:27 a.m., and the temperature is a pleasant 78 degrees. Before we begin deplaning, I'd like to ask for your patience as we allow our distinguished passenger, Colonel William Anderson, Medal of Honor recipient, to depart first with his escort." A spontaneous applause broke out among the passengers, many of whom had been watching the unusual proceedings with interest throughout the flight. Bill felt a flush of emotion, not embarrassment now, but a complex mixture of pride, humility, and profound gratitude. As he carefully rose from his seat, using his cane for support, General Harrington and the two Marine officers positioned themselves in a loose formation around him, not crowding or suggesting he needed physical assistance, but providing a dignified escort that acknowledged both his status and his privacy. The deplaning process was unlike any Bill had experienced in his decades of travel. The flight crew lined the jet bridge, standing at attention as he passed. At the gate, a small gathering awaited, not the large ceremonial welcome that might have been arranged with more notice, but something that touched Bill far more deeply. Claire stood at the front, her posture as military straight as it had been during her service years, though her eyes shone with the unmistakable warmth of a daughter seeing her beloved father. Beside her was her husband Robert, a former Navy corpsman who had met Claire during a joint operation in the Middle East. And there, in Robert's arms, wearing a tiny dress covered in butterflies, was Emma, the great-granddaughter Bill had traveled to see. Behind this immediate family stood a loose formation of veterans, some in civilian clothes with military insignia on caps or lapels, others in current service dress uniforms, representing not just the Marines but all branches. They had assembled with remarkable speed, word having spread through veteran networks about the morning's events and the arrival of a legend among them. Claire stepped forward as Bill emerged from the jet bridge, her professional composure momentarily cracking as she embraced her father. "Dad," she whispered, "what on earth happened?" "We got calls saying you were being escorted by the commandant himself." Bill returned the embrace, then drew back to look at his daughter properly. "It's been quite a morning, Claire Bear," he said, using the childhood nickname that still made her smile. "I'll explain everything, but first," his eyes moved to the small figure in Robert's arms. "I believe I have a birthday girl to greet." Robert stepped forward, adjusting Emma in his arms so she could see her great-grandfather. The baby, who had been contentedly playing with a set of plastic keys, looked up at Bill with wide, curious eyes so like Martha's that Bill felt his heart contract with a sweet familiar ache. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "Grandpa, Bill has come a very long way to see you today." Emma regarded him solemnly for a moment, then broke into a gummy smile, reaching out with pudgy hands toward his face. Bill leaned forward, allowing her tiny fingers to pat his cheeks with the uncoordinated enthusiasm of infancy. In that moment, the morning's indignities, the subsequent drama, even the pain in his hip all receded into insignificance. This connection, across 4 generations, this continuation of life and love, was what mattered. It was what had always mattered through war and peace, triumph and loss. General Harrington, observing the family reunion with respectful distance, stepped forward. Only when Bill beckoned him closer. "Claire, you remember General Harrington," Bill said. Claire's eyes widened slightly. She had known James Harrington as a colonel when she was serving, but his rise to commandant had occurred after her retirement. "Of course," she said, offering a crisp salute that the general returned immediately. "It's an honor, sir. Though I admit I'm somewhat confused by your presence here." "The honor is mine, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson," the general replied formally, then relaxed into a warmer tone. "Your father had some difficulty with airport security in Atlanta this morning. Word reached my office, and since I was in the area, I thought it appropriate to ensure his journey continued without further incident." Claire's expression shifted from confusion to concern to something approaching anger. "Difficulty? What kind of difficulty requires the commandant's personal intervention?" Bill placed a calming hand on his daughter's arm. "It's been addressed, Claire. More than addressed, actually. I believe some good may come of it for other veterans facing similar situations." Robert, who had been quietly observing while keeping Emma entertained, spoke up. "Sir, whatever happened, we're grateful you're here safely." He glanced at his watch. "The party starts at 2. We have time to get you settled at the house first if you'd like to rest." Bill was about to accept this sensible suggestion when he noticed Rebecca, the young woman from the flight, standing uncertainly at the periphery of the gathering, her single carry-on bag clutched tightly as if for emotional support as much as convenience. "One moment," he said, gesturing toward her. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." Rebecca approached hesitantly, clearly intimidated by the impromptu receiving line of military brass and veterans that had formed around Bill. "Claire, Robert, this is Rebecca Mercer," Bill introduced her. Her father was Sergeant Daniel Mercer, Marines. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan. The significance of this introduction and the respectful way Bill presented her was not lost on anyone present. Claire's expression softened immediately. "Ms. Mercer, welcome to Dallas. Are you here visiting?" "No, ma'am," Rebecca replied. "I'm moving here, starting a new job on Monday." "Do you have arrangements for the weekend?" Claire asked her, natural tendency to take charge evident in her tone. Rebecca hesitated. "I have a hotel reservation starting tonight. I was going to find somewhere to wait until check-in time." Claire exchanged a quick glance with Robert, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Nonsense," she declared. "You'll come with us. We have plenty of room, and Emma's party this afternoon will have enough food to feed a platoon." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Oh, I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," Claire assured her firmly. "It's what we do. Your father was Marine Corps. That makes you family." General Harrington, who had been quietly observing this exchange, stepped forward. "Ms. Mercer, I meant what I said on the flight. I'd like to hear about your father. Perhaps you could join us for dinner this evening as well? I'll be in Dallas overnight before returning to Washington." The sudden inclusion, the unexpected welcome from strangers connected only by the invisible bonds of military service, seemed to overwhelm Rebecca. Tears welled in her eyes, though she fought to maintain composure. "Thank you," she managed. Thank you." Bill watched the interaction with quiet approval. This was the true heart of military service, not the medals or the ceremonies, but the community that transcended time and circumstance, the understanding that no one who served or supported those who served was ever truly alone. As the group prepared to leave the terminal, the gathered veterans stepped forward one by one to shake Bill's hand, offer quick words of respect or gratitude, and welcome him to Dallas. Some were Vietnam-era contemporaries, others young enough to be his grandchildren, their service in conflicts he had only read about. But all shared the unique bond that came from putting on the uniform, from pledging life and safety in service to something larger than themselves. Moving through the airport toward the exit, Bill was struck by how differently he was being perceived compared to just hours earlier in Atlanta. The same age, the same physical limitations, the same cane supporting his steps, but now surrounded by respect rather than suspicion, seen for his value rather than his vulnerabilities. The contrast was both gratifying and troubling. Every veteran deserved to be seen as whole, as valuable, as worthy of accommodation without humiliation. Not every aging service member had a general to intervene when dignity was denied. This thought strengthened Bill's resolve to engage with the program Secretary Mitchell had mentioned, to ensure that what happened to him might lead to better treatment for all who had served. Outside, the Dallas sun was bright and warm, the air carrying that distinctive Texas heat that seemed to rise from the very pavement. Claire had arranged for a small caravan of vehicles to transport their now expanded group to her home in a quiet suburb north of the city. As Bill carefully settled into the passenger seat of Claire's SUV, Emma secured in her car seat behind them, he felt a profound sense of completion. The journey had been more complicated than anticipated, but he had arrived where he needed to be when he needed to be there. "So, Dad," Claire said as she navigated out of the airport complex, Are you going to tell me what really happened in Atlanta? And how you ended up with a military escort led by the commandant himself? Bill smiled, watching the Dallas skyline recede in the side mirror. It's quite a story, he admitted. It begins with a young TSA agent who thought I was too old and frail to travel alone. Claire's expression darkened. He said what? Easy, Lieutenant Colonel, Bill cautioned with a small smile. As I said, it's been addressed, rather thoroughly in fact. As they drove toward the celebration awaiting them, Bill reflected on the day's unexpected journey, not just the physical travel from Atlanta to Dallas, but the journey from invisibility to recognition, from dismissal to respect. He thought of Peters, the TSA agent, and hoped the young man had truly learned something beyond fear of consequences. He thought of Rebecca, carrying the weight of her father's loss, perhaps finding some healing in the community that had embraced her today. And he thought of little Emma in the back seat, too young to understand any of what had transpired, but the beneficiary nonetheless of a world that would hopefully continue to improve in its treatment of those who served. The most important journey, Bill realized, wasn't the flights or the accolades or even the policy changes. It was the continuing effort to bridge the gaps between civilian and military understanding, to ensure that service was recognized not just in moments of ceremonial acknowledgement, but in the everyday interactions that define dignity and respect. It was a journey that would continue long after today's drama had faded from memory, a journey he was still very much a part of, even at 78, even with a cane, even without a uniform. Because some missions continued long after the official orders ended. And William Anderson had never been one to leave a mission incomplete. The Anderson family home sat on a tree-lined street in a quiet Dallas suburb. Spacious single-story ranch house with a wide front porch and carefully tended gardens that Martha had designed years ago. Claire and Robert had purchased it when Bill decided to move closer to them after Martha's passing, wanting to provide him with independence while keeping him within easy reach. The caravan of vehicles pulled into the circular driveway, and Bill felt a surge of warmth at the sight of the birthday decorations already adorning the porch, colorful banners and balloons proclaiming, "Happy First Birthday, Emma," in cheerful lettering. Even from outside, he could see signs of preparation through the large front window streamers hanging from the ceiling, a high chair decorated with ribbons, and the bustling movement of people setting up for the celebration. As Claire helped him from the car, Bill took a moment to collect himself. The journey had taken more out of him than he cared to admit, not just physically, but emotionally. The morning's confrontation, the subsequent drama, and the whirlwind of attention had drained his reserves more thoroughly than he had realized. "You okay, Dad?" Claire asked quietly, her keen eyes missing nothing. "Just catching my breath," he assured her with a smile. "It's been quite a day already." She nodded, understanding without requiring further explanation. "We've set up the guest room for you. Why don't you rest a bit before the party? Emma won't mind if her great-grandpa needs a power nap." Bill was about to politely decline old habits of pushing through discomfort, dying hard, when he caught Robert's knowing glance. His son-in-law, with his medical background, had clearly registered Bill's fatigue as well. "Maybe just a short rest," Bill conceded, recognizing the wisdom in pacing himself. The party was still 2 hours away, and he wanted to be fully present for it. As they approached the house, the front door opened to reveal a lanky teenage boy with Claire's determined chin and a shock of unruly dark hair. Michael, Bill's 16-year-old grandson, had shot up nearly 6 inches in the year since Bill had last seen him. "Grandpa." Michael bounded down the steps with the exuberance of youth, then caught himself, moderating his approach as if suddenly remembering his grandfather's age. The moment of hesitation was brief, but noticeable, a split-second calculation of how to greet an elderly relative. Bill recognized it instantly. He had seen that same hesitation in the eyes of the TSA agents, in the subtle recalibrations people made when they saw his cane before they saw him. But unlike Peter's, Michael's adjustment came from a place of care, not dismissal. "Michael," Bill greeted warmly, opening his free arm for an embrace. "When did you get so tall?" "They must be putting something in the water here in Texas." The boy grinned, his momentary uncertainty vanishing as he carefully hugged his grandfather. "Mom says it's all the basketball practice. Dad says it's because I eat everything that isn't nailed down." Both sound like reasonable explanations, Bill laughed, surprised as always by how his voice softened around his family. The command, presence that had directed troops in combat, became something gentler, though no less genuine, when surrounded by those he loved. The reunion continued on the porch, with Robert's parents, Ted and Eleanor Harris, emerging to welcome Bill with warm familiarity. Eleanor, a retired schoolteacher with a practical manner and kind eyes, had taken to Bill immediately when Claire and Robert married, claiming that military men make the best fathers-in-law because they appreciate good cooking and never complain about the thermostat. Ted, himself a Vietnam-era Navy veteran, clasped Bill's hand firmly. "Good to see you, Bill. Heard there was some excitement on your trip down." News traveled fast in military circles, and Ted was still connected through his veterans groups. "Nothing worth dwelling on," Bill replied with a meaningful glance toward Michael, not wanting to burden the boy with the morning's unpleasantness. "Though I seem to have acquired quite an entourage." Indeed, the front yard now contained an unusual assembly. General Harrington and his aides stood conversing quietly with a group of local veterans who had followed from the airport. Rebecca Mercer was being introduced to Claire's neighbors, and a sleek black SUV had just pulled up, disgorging what appeared to be a liaison officer from the governor's office, complete with an official-looking envelope. Claire, surveying this unexpected gathering with the logistical assessment of a former officer, made an executive decision. "Dad, you and Rebecca head inside with Michael. He'll show you to your rooms. Mom Harris, could you help Rebecca get settled in the blue guest room? Dad, you're in your usual room. The rest of us will handle this impromptu receiving line and redirect everyone to return for the party at 2. Bill nodded gratefully, recognizing his daughter's skill at managing complex situations, a talent she had honed commanding Marines and now applied to family logistics with equal effectiveness. Michael led the way inside, carrying Bill's small suitcase and chatting about his latest basketball tournament. The familiar interior of the house enveloped Bill like a comfortable embrace. Claire had preserved many of Martha's decorating touches while adding her own personality to the space. Family photos lined the hallway, 4 generations of service members interspersed with wedding portraits, baby pictures, and candid moments of joy. Bill's and Martha's wedding photo held a place of honor in the center. Bill in his dress blues, Martha radiant in a simple white dress, both impossibly young and solemn-faced in the formal portrait style of the era. "Mom put up more pictures since you were here last," Michael commented, noticing Bill's gaze lingering on the photo wall. "She found a bunch of old ones in the attic when we were setting up Emma's nursery." Bill nodded, his throat suddenly tight with emotion. Among the newer additions was a photo he hadn't seen in decades himself as a young lieutenant, arms slung casually around the shoulders of his best friend and fellow officer, James Harrington, both of them dusty and exhausted, but grinning after a training exercise. The juxtaposition of that moment with the formality of the general's current position struck him as both poignant and amusing. Michael showed Bill to the guest room that had become his room over the past 2 years, a comfortable space with a hospital-grade bed, Claire's insistence after his last hip surgery, and furnishings arranged to accommodate his mobility needs without making the accommodations obvious. The walls held his military shadow box displaying his medals, and several of his favorite books had permanent places on the bedside table. "Thanks, Michael," Bill said as his grandson set down the suitcase. "I think I will take that power nap your mother suggested." The boy nodded, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Of course." Mom said a general came with you because someone was mean to you at the airport. Michael's directness, unfiltered by adult social constraints, cut straight to the heart of the matter. Why would anyone be mean to you? You're a hero. The simple question, asked with a teenager's blunt curiosity and indignation, touched Bill deeply. It wasn't about me personally, Michael, he explained carefully. Sometimes people see age or disability and make assumptions about capability. It happens to many veterans, not just me. Michael frowned, processing this with the intense focus of adolescence. That's stupid. Being old doesn't make you less of who you are. No, it doesn't, Bill agreed, struck by the wisdom in the boys. Straightforward assessment. But not everyone understands that. That's why it's important to look beyond the surface, to see the person, not just their age or their cane or their wheelchair. Michael nodded solemnly. Like how Mom always says we should judge people by their actions, not their appearance. Exactly like that, Bill smiled. Your mother is a wise woman. She says she learned it from you, Michael replied, then glanced at his watch. I should let you rest. Mom will kill me if I keep you talking when you're supposed to be napping. As the door closed behind his grandson, Bill eased himself onto the bed with a sigh of relief. The comfort of the mattress, perfectly suited to his back's needs, was welcome after the confines of airplane seating. He didn't bother removing his shoes, knowing he would only be resting briefly. As he closed his eyes, the events of the morning replayed in his mind, not the confrontation itself, but the aftermath. The spontaneous gathering of support, the ripple effects already spreading beyond his individual experience. Secretary Mitchell's proposed Anderson Protocol, the Veterans Service Office at the Atlanta airport, the training programs being implemented, all from what had begun as a simple journey to a birthday party. Bill drifted into a light doze, his dreams a mixture of past and present young Marines under his command blending with the faces he had seen today, Martha's voice merging with Emma's baby laughter. He woke to a gentle knock at the door and Claire's voice calling softly, Dad? It's 1:30. Thought you might want time to freshen up before the party. Thank you, Claire Bear, he called back, using the childhood nickname that still made her smile. I'll be out shortly. Bill rose carefully, taking a moment to let his body adjust to the movement. The short rest had helped, though his hip still protested after the day's exertions. He moved to the adjoining bathroom, where he splashed cold water on his face and combed his white hair with military precision. From his suitcase, he retrieved a small, carefully wrapped package, Emma's birthday gift. The wooden music box had been crafted by a fellow veteran in Bill's woodworking group, but Bill had personally designed the inlay on the lid, a delicate pattern of butterflies and flowers that matched the garden Martha had planted outside this very house. When he emerged from the guest room, the house had transformed. What had been preparation was now completion, decorations perfectly placed, food arranged on buffet tables, and the living room rearranged to accommodate the guests who were already beginning to arrive. Claire spotted him immediately, breaking away from a conversation to come to his side. Perfect timing, Dad. How was your rest? Just what I needed, he assured her. The party looks wonderful. You've done an amazing job as always. She smiled, some of the military crispness in her bearing softening. Well, I had help. Rebecca has quite the eye for detail. She's been arranging centerpieces and entertaining Emma while I finish the food. As if summoned by her name, Rebecca appeared with Emma in her arms. The baby was dressed in a frilly party dress with tiny pink shoes, her fine hair adorned with a small bow that she was making valiant efforts to remove. Colonel Anderson, Rebecca greeted him, her earlier shyness replaced by a more relaxed demeanor. Your great-granddaughter and I have been getting acquainted. She's quite the conversationalist. Emma, recognizing Bill, let out a delighted squeal and lunged toward him with the confidence of a child who knows she will be caught. Bill chuckled, setting his cane against a chair to free both hands as he carefully took the squirming infant "Hello, birthday girl," he said softly, his weathered face transforming with a smile that erased decades of hardship. Emma patted his cheeks with chubby hands, babbling excitedly. The moment was captured by Robert, who had quietly appeared with a camera. "That's one for the wall," he said with satisfaction. 4 generations of Andersons in one frame. The party swelled with arrivals, neighborhood families with children, Claire and Robert's colleagues and friends, and a surprising number of veterans who had somehow learned of Bill's presence. General Harrington had returned as promised, though. He had changed from his formal uniform to more understated civilian attire, his military bearings still unmistakable despite the casual clothing. The general approached Bill, who was now seated in a comfortable armchair with Emma playing on the floor nearby, under Rebecca's watchful eye. "She's beautiful, Bill," Harrington said, nodding toward the baby. "Martha's eyes, undoubtedly." "And her spirit," Bill agreed. "Determined, even at this age. Nothing stops her." The general smiled. "An Anderson through and through, then." He lowered his voice slightly. "I wanted you to know the story has spread. The Secretary of Defense called me personally after speaking with Mitchell. There's talk of using this incident as a catalyst for a more comprehensive veteran recognition program across all federal agencies." Bill shook his head, still somewhat uncomfortable with the attention his experience had generated. "It seems disproportionate on just one veteran who happened to have powerful friends." "That's precisely why it matters," Harrington countered. "Because for every William Anderson with connections to flag officers, there are 1,000 veterans facing the same dismissive treatment without recourse. Your experience is making visible what has been invisible for too long." Before Bill could respond, Claire called for everyone's attention. The time had come for the birthday cake and Emma's first attempt at blowing out a candle, a milestone moment. Robert lifted the baby into her high chair, which had been decorated with streamers, and positioned at the head of the table. The guests gathered around, cameras ready. Claire brought out a small, beautifully decorated cake with a single candle. As everyone began to sing "Happy Birthday," Bill watched Emma's face, her expression shifting from confusion to delight as she became the center of attention. In that ordinary moment of family celebration, Bill felt an extraordinary sense of continuity. The chain of life extending backward through his own parents and forward through Claire, Michael, and now Emma, the traditions passing from generation to generation. The values he and Martha had lived by, now embedded in the family they had created. Together. After the cake, most of which ended up on Emma's face rather than in her mouth, and the opening of presents, the party began to naturally separate into conversation groups. Children played in the backyard under the supervision of teenagers. Adults clustered in the living room and kitchen, and a contingent of veterans gravitated to the porch, where war stories were exchanged with the dark humor and shorthand understanding unique to those who had served. Bill found himself moving between these worlds, welcomed in each, bridging the civilian-military divide with the ease of long practice. He noticed Rebecca doing something similar, initially hovering at the edges of conversations, but gradually being drawn in, particularly by the veterans who had known her father or served in the same areas. As the afternoon progressed, Bill observed a subtle transformation in the young woman. The grief that had been evident in her bearing that morning was still present, but it seemed lighter somehow, balanced by new connections and the simple human comfort of being included. Around 4 o'clock, when the party was beginning to wind down, the doorbell rang. Claire answered it to find 2 uniformed Marines on the porch, accompanied by a civilian in a formal suit. "Mrs. Harris?" the senior Marine asked. "I'm Captain Reynolds, and this is Lieutenant James. We're here on behalf of the Marine Corps' Heritage Foundation. Is Colonel Anderson available?" Claire, surprised but composed, invited them in. "My father is in the living room. May I ask what this is regarding?" The civilian stepped forward, extending his hand. "Charles Whitmore, Ma'am, Executive Director of the Foundation. We received word of Colonel Anderson's experience this morning and his presence here in Dallas. We have something we'd like to present to him, with your permission. Claire led the unexpected guests to the living room, where Bill was engaged in conversation with Ted Harris and several other veterans. The room quieted as the uniformed Marines entered, all eyes turning to the newcomers. Bill started to rise, his military instincts responding to the presence of uniformed personnel, but Captain Reynolds quickly gestured for him to remain seated. "Please, sir, don't get up on our account." Charles Whitmore stepped forward. "Colonel Anderson, I apologize for the intrusion on this family occasion, but when we learned of your presence in Dallas, we felt it couldn't wait. The Marine Corps' Heritage Foundation has been developing a new program called Semper Fidelis for Life, focused on honoring veterans across all generations and ensuring their stories are preserved for future Marines." He produced an elegant leather-bound folio from a case he carried. "We would be honored if you would accept the position of honorary chairman for this initiative. Your experience today has already catalyzed significant policy discussions at the FIGO national level. Your leadership would be invaluable in shaping this program." Bill blinked in surprise, momentarily at a loss for words. He glanced at General Harrington, who nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming that he had been aware of this development. "Mr. Whitmore," Bill began carefully, "I'm flattered by the offer, but I'm not sure I'm the right person. There are many veterans more qualified." "With respect, sir," Captain Reynolds interjected, "few have your combination of distinguished service record, personal experience with the challenges veterans face, and the moral authority that comes from living the Corps' values for over half a century." Lieutenant James, the younger of the two Marines, added earnestly, "Sir, the Commandant often quotes your leadership principles in his addresses to officer candidates. Your influence already shapes the Corps. This would formalize that role and extend it to veteran advocacy." Bill felt a complex mixture of emotions: honor at being asked, hesitation about taking on such a responsibility at his age, and a deep sense of duty that had never diminished despite his retirement. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of family and fellow veterans, all watching expectantly. His gaze settled on Rebecca, who stood near the back of the room. In her expression, he saw something that helped crystallize his decision: hope, tentative but real, that systems could change, that her father's struggles might mean something in the larger picture of veteran care. "I would be honored to serve in this capacity," Bill said finally, his voice steady and clear. "On one condition." "Sir?" Whitmore inquired. "That the program includes specific outreach to families of veterans who've struggled with the transition to civilian life or who've lost their battles with the invisible wounds of war." Bill nodded toward Rebecca. "The service family extends beyond those who wore the uniform, and our responsibility to them is equally sacred." Whitmore nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely, Colonel. In fact, we had planned a family support component, but your suggestion gives it the prominence it deserves." The formal presentation proceeded with Captain Reynolds handing Bill the leather folio, which contained not only the official appointment letter but also a specially minted medallion bearing the Marine Corps' emblem and the words "Semper Fidelis" for life around its edge. As the Marines and Whitmore prepared to depart, having declined Claire's offer to stay for refreshments due to other commitments, Lieutenant James lingered briefly. "Colonel Anderson," he said quietly, "my grandfather served under your command in Vietnam. He didn't make it home, but my grandmother always told me how you wrote to her personally. Not just the standard letter, but a real account of who he was as a Marine and a man." The young officer's voice thickened slightly. "That letter is still in our family Bible. It's why I joined the Corps." Before Bill could respond, the lieutenant snapped to attention and offered a perfect salute, a gesture of respect from one generation of Marines to another, bridging decades of service. Bill returned it from his seated position, the movement as precise as it had been in his active duty days. As the door closed behind the departing visitors, the living room remained quiet for a moment, the weight of the interaction settling over the gathering. Then Emma, oblivious to the solemnity of the moment, let out a delighted shriek as she discovered a forgotten balloon under the coffee table, breaking the tension and drawing laughter from everyone present. Life continuing, as it always did, through moments of ceremony and simple joy alike. The party gradually dispersed as the afternoon turned to evening. Families with young children departed first, followed by neighbors and more distant friends. By 6 o'clock, only the core group remained: Bill, Claire and her family, General Harrington and his aide, Rebecca, and a few close veterans who had been invited to stay for a more intimate dinner. As Claire and Robert began clearing away the party debris, Bill found himself on the back porch with General Harrington, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in spectacular shades of orange and purple. Michael was showing Rebecca how to use the telescope he had set up, pointing out early appearing stars with the enthusiasm of adolescence. "You've raised a fine family, Bill," Harrington observed, sipping the coffee Claire had provided. "They do you and Martha proud." Bill nodded, his chest tight with emotion he wouldn't have allowed himself to show in his younger years. "They're the best thing I ever did, better than any mission or medal." The general smiled. "I remember when Claire was born. You were different. After that, still the toughest sob in the battalion. But there was something else there too. A clarity about what mattered." "She centered me," Bill acknowledged. "Made the sacrifices meaningful in a different way. I was no longer just fighting for abstract principles. I was fighting for her future, for the world she would inherit." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, two old warriors watching a peaceful evening unfold the peace they had fought to secure for generations, like Michael's and Emma's. "About this Heritage Foundation position," Bill said finally, "I meant what I said about families being included, but I'm concerned about the time commitment. At my age." Harrington waved off the concern. "It's largely symbolic, Bill. Quarterly meetings, some public appearances when you feel up to it. They're not expecting you to run a day-to-day operation. They want your name, your moral authority, and your occasional wisdom. The staff will handle the details." Bill considered this. "And you think it would make a difference? Actually improve things for veterans facing what I face today?" "I know it will," Harrington replied with conviction. "The military listens to you, Bill, so does Washington, when you choose to speak. This morning proved that. One phone call set in motion a response that would have taken months through normal channels." Before Bill could respond, Claire appeared at the door. "Dinner's ready, gentlemen. We've set up in the dining room." The meal was simple but elegant. Claire had inherited Martha's talent for making ordinary food feel like a special occasion. The conversation flowed easily around the table, shifting between light-hearted family stories and more serious discussions about veteran issues. During a natural lull, Rebecca spoke up hesitantly. "Colonel Anderson, General Harrington, I wanted to thank you both. Today has been unexpected." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "After my father died, I felt disconnected from the military community that had been part of my life growing up. I was angry at the system that I thought had failed him. Today reminded me that there's still a place for me in that community, that his service still matters." Bill reached across the table to briefly clasp her hand. "Your father's sacrifice is honored here, Rebecca. And you are welcome in this extended family, always." General Harrington added, "The Corps never forgets its own, or those who love them. Sometimes we need reminding of our obligations, but the foundation remains solid." The evening continued with coffee and Martha's famous apple pie recipe, which Claire had mastered. Emma, overtired from the excitement of the day, had been put to bed after dinner, but the baby monitor on the table occasionally transmitted her soft baby sighs and murmurs. Around 9 o'clock, Bill began to feel the days events catching up with him. The emotional and physical toll had been significant, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The formal dinner General Harrington had arranged with local Marine Corps leadership, the initial planning meeting for the Heritage Foundation, position, and the quiet moments with family that were Bill's true priority. As if reading his thoughts, Claire began orchestrating the evening's conclusion with the diplomatic skill that had served her well as an officer. Dad looks ready to call it a night, and we should let him rest. It's been quite a day. Goodbyes were exchanged, with General Harrington departing for his hotel with promises to return the following morning. The remaining guests filtered out, leaving only the family and Rebecca, who had been given the guest room for the duration of her stay, Claire's insistence overriding her initial protests. As Bill prepared for bed in the quiet comfort of his room, he reflected on the day's journey, not just the physical distance from Atlanta to Dallas, but the emotional terrain he had traversed. From the humiliation of being dismissed as too old and frail, to the unexpected elevation as a symbol of veteran dignity and rights. He thought of Emma, peaceful in her crib down the hall, who would grow up in a world shaped by the actions and choices of generations before her. Would she face a better, more compassionate society than the one that had confronted him that morning? He hoped so. He would work to make it so, for whatever time he had left. As sleep began to claim him, Bill's last conscious thought was of Martha. She would have been amused by today's drama, proud of his response, and practical about what came next. "Well, Billy," he could almost hear her say, "seems you're not done serving yet. Some missions find you, even when you think you're retired." He smiled in the darkness. Some missions indeed. 6 months after the incident at Atlanta International Airport, Colonel William Anderson stood at the podium in the East Room of the White House, his dress blues immaculate, the Medal of Honor on his neck catching the light of the chandeliers. His cane rested discreetly against the lectern, but he stood tall, his posture reflecting the dignity that had defined his life of service. The room was filled to capacity: cabinet members, military leaders, congressional representatives, and veterans advocates, all gathered for the official signing of Executive Order 14,118, formally establishing the Veterans Dignity and Access Initiative. At the center of the front row sat Claire and her family, including little Emma, now 18 months old and dressed in a miniature Marine Corps dress uniform that had been specially made for her, complete with tiny white gloves. Beside them sat Rebecca Mercer, now the initiative's family outreach coordinator, a position she had embraced with passion and purpose. "Mr. President," Bill began, his voice strong despite his 79 years, "distinguished guests, fellow veterans, and family members. 6 months ago, I was simply an old Marine trying to board a flight to see my great-granddaughter's first birthday." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the audience. The story had become well known, a catalyst for the comprehensive legislation now being enacted. "What happened that day was unfortunate," Bill continued, "but not unusual. Every day, veterans across this nation face similar indignities, denied the respect they've earned, confronting systems designed without consideration for their unique needs, treated as burdens rather than as valued citizens who once answered their country's highest calling." He paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled dignitaries. "Today, we take a significant step toward correcting that oversight. This executive order, combined with the Congressional Veterans Dignity Act, creates a framework that recognizes our obligation to those who served not as charity, but as a fulfillment of the promise made when they first took their oath." Bill looked down at his prepared remarks, then set them aside. "I'd like to speak from the heart for a moment," he said, his tone becoming more personal. "When I joined the Marines in 1965, I was 18 years old, full of patriotism and idealism, but with little understanding of what service truly meant. I learned that lesson in the jungles of Vietnam, on peacekeeping missions in the Middle East, and in training young officers who would go on to face their own conflicts." He gestured toward General Harrington, seated in his dress uniform in the front row. I learned that service isn't defined by medals or rank, but by the bond forged with those who stand beside you in dark moments, by the commitment to leave no one behind, not on the battlefield, not in civilian life, not in the twilight years when the uniform is long packed away, but the oath remains binding in our hearts. The room was utterly silent, captivated by the quiet authority of a man who had lived the principles he described. The true measure of a nation isn't found in its military might or economic power, Bill continued, but in how it treats those who have sacrificed for its ideals. Today, we recognize that dignity is not a privilege to be granted or withheld based on convenience or circumstance. It is a right earned through service and sacrifice. Bill looked directly at Emma, who was watching her great-grandfather with solemn fascination. The initiatives we establish today will ensure that future generations understand the debt we owe to veterans of all ages and abilities. They will create systems that accommodate physical limitations without diminishing personal autonomy. They will train personnel to recognize that age and injury do not erase identity or competence. He returned his gaze to the broader audience. But laws and programs, however well-intentioned, are only frameworks. True change requires a shift in perspective, a commitment from each of us to see beyond the surface, to recognize the whole person, not just their age or physical condition. I stand before you today not as a symbol, but as one veteran among millions. My story gained attention because of the remarkable response it triggered. But countless similar stories unfold every day without cameras or generals or cabinet secretaries to intervene. It is for those unheard veterans that this initiative matters most. The president rose, approaching the podium to stand beside Bill. "Colonel Anderson," he said, his voice carrying through the room's sound system, "on behalf of a grateful nation, I thank you not only for your distinguished military service, but for your continued leadership in ensuring all veterans receive the dignity and respect they have earned." The president turned to the audience. The Anderson Protocol being signed into law today will fundamentally transform how federal agencies interact with veterans, particularly those with age-related or combat-induced disabilities. It mandates specialized training for TSA and other public-facing federal employees, creates expedited processing systems at transportation hubs, and establishes veteran service offices at major airports nationwide. He lifted the ceremonial pen. But perhaps most importantly, it creates accountability, ensuring that what happened to Colonel Anderson becomes increasingly rare, and when it does occur, is addressed swiftly and comprehensively. The signing ceremony proceeded with the formal precision of White House events. Bill remained standing throughout, though Claire could see the subtle signs of fatigue he worked to conceal, the slight shift of weight to ease pressure on his hip, the carefully controlled breathing techniques he had learned during rehabilitation. When the ceremony concluded, the assembled guests moved to the state dining room for a reception. Bill found himself surrounded by well-wishers and officials, eager to discuss the initiative's implementation. He navigated these conversations with the diplomatic skill honed through decades of military leadership, but his gaze frequently sought out his family, his true north, in the sometimes overwhelming sea of attention. General Harrington appeared at his side during a momentary lull, providing a tactical extraction that Bill recognized and appreciated. "The president would like a few minutes in the Oval Office before you leave," Harrington informed him quietly. "Just you, him, and your family if you'd like them to join." Bill nodded, gathering Claire, Robert, Michael, and little Emma with a glance. Rebecca hesitated until Bill explicitly motioned her forward. She had become, in many ways, an extended member of the Anderson family over the past 6 months. The small group was escorted through the West Wing's corridors, the Marine Guards snapping to attention as Bill passed. The Oval Office door opened, and the president welcomed them personally, his formal demeanor from the ceremony softening into a more genuine warmth. "Colonel, please, have a seat," he gestured to one of the couches. I wanted a moment away from the cameras and the political theater. This initiative matters to me personally, not just politically. As they settled into the historic room, Bill noted the president's desktop, where a framed photograph stood prominently, a much younger version of the commander-in-chief in desert camouflage, standing beside a helicopter in what appeared to be Afghanistan. The president followed his gaze. 2 tours, he confirmed. Nothing like your service record, but enough to understand what veterans face when they return to civilian life. For the next 20 minutes, the conversation flowed naturally between topics, the president sharing his own experiences with VA healthcare, Bill discussing the positive changes he'd observed since the Atlanta incident, and Claire offering her perspective as both a veteran and the daughter of a veteran. Emma, unimpressed by presidential power, eventually squirmed out of Robert's lap and toddled around the historic office, examining everything within reach with the fearless curiosity of early childhood. The president watched her with amused tolerance, waving off a nervous aide who moved to intercept her exploration of the presidential seal woven into the carpet. "Let her be," he said, smiling. "That seal belongs to her as much as to me. Her great-grandfather helped defend everything it stands." F.O. As their time drew to a close, the president reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small box. "Colonel, I have something for you. It's not an official gift, just something I thought you might appreciate." Bill opened the box to find a challenge coin unlike any in his considerable collection. One side bore the presidential seal. The other featured an image of the Medal of Honor with the words, "With age comes honor, with service comes dignity," encircling. I had these made specially," the president explained. "Only 100 exist. They're being given to Medal of Honor recipients and key architects of the Veterans Dignity Initiative. A reminder of what we're working toward." Bill held the weighty coin in his palm, feeling the raised metal under his fingertips. "Thank you, Mr. President. It will have a place of honor in my collection." As they prepared to leave, the president had one final question. "Colonel, when all this began 6 months ago, did you have any idea it would lead to the East Room of the White House?" Bill chuckled softly. "Sir, at my age, I've learned to expect the unexpected. But no, when I was trying to convince that TSA agent I could manage a 2-hour flight to Dallas, I wasn't thinking about changing federal policy. I was just thinking about Emma's birthday cake." The president laughed. "That's often how the most significant changes begin, not with grand visions, but with someone simply trying to do what matters most to them personally." As they left the White House, navigating the security protocols and media presence with the assistance of staff, Bill felt a deep sense of completion. The journey that had begun with humiliation had transformed into something powerful and positive. Just for him, but for veterans across the nation. The limousine provided by the White House delivered them to their hotel, where Bill finally allowed himself to acknowledge the fatigue he had been fighting all day. Claire, ever observant, immediately recognized the signs. "Dad, you need to rest." "Before dinner," she said firmly. "The reception at the Marine Barracks isn't until 7. That gives you 3 hours." Bill nodded, too tired to argue and knowing she was right. His stamina, while remarkable for his age, had its limits. The day's emotions and physical demands had pushed those limits to their edge. In his hotel suite, as he carefully removed his dress blues and medal, Bill reflected on the 6 months that had passed since Atlanta. The changes had been swift and far-reaching, not just in policy, but in his personal life as well. The Marine Corps' Heritage Foundation position had evolved from a symbolic role to an active one, with Bill providing guidance on veteran outreach programs and speaking regularly at events across the country. His story had resonated deeply, particularly with aging veterans who had faced similar dismissals and with younger service members, concerned about what awaited them in civilian life. Rebecca had flourished in her role with the initiative, channeling her grief over her father's death into meaningful advocacy work. She had moved permanently to Dallas, becoming a regular presence at the Anderson family gatherings and developing a particular bond with Michael, who was now considering a military career himself. Most surprisingly, Bill had found himself reluctantly embracing technology, allowing Claire to set him up with social media accounts managed by the Heritage Foundation staff, but featuring his direct input on veteran issues. His straightforward, occasionally blunt perspectives had garnered a substantial following, particularly among younger veterans who appreciated his unfiltered honesty about both the challenges and rewards of service. As he stretched out on the hotel bed, not bothering to get under the covers for his short rest, Bill smiled at the irony. At 79, he had somehow become busier than he'd been at 78. With a calendar managed by a foundation assistant and requests for appearances that far exceeded his ability to fulfill them. Yet amidst this whirlwind of activity, he had maintained his focus on what truly mattered: family, fellow veterans, and the principles that had guided his life. He had declined numerous commercial opportunities that would have capitalized on his sudden prominence, accepting only those engagements that directly supported veteran causes. Sleep claimed him quickly, his body's need overriding the thoughts still cycling through his mind. He dreamed of Martha, not unusual, but these dreams were different from the melancholy visions that had haunted him after her passing. Now she appeared as she had in their prime, vibrant and laughing, seated in the garden she had loved, looking up at him with that particular expression that had always meant, "I told you so." He woke to Claire's gentle knock 2 hours later, feeling refreshed in both body and spirit. The dream lingered, leaving him with a sense of Martha's continued presence and approval. She had always believed his greatest contributions might come after his military service ended, in the wisdom and perspective age would bring if he remained engaged with the world rather than withdrawing from it. "Dad," Claire called through the door. "Are you awake?" "Yes, come in," he responded, sitting up and reaching for his cane. Claire entered, already dressed for the evening in her own dress blues, the silver oak leaves of her lieutenant colonel, rank gleaming on her shoulders. Seeing her in uniform always filled Bill with a particular pride, the continuation of service across generations, the values transmitted not through DNA, but through example and choice. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her assessing gaze missing nothing. "Better," he assured her. "Ready for round 2 of today's festivities." She smiled, satisfied with what she saw. "Good. Michael is practically vibrating with excitement about seeing the silent drill platoon perform tonight. He's been watching videos of them online for weeks." Bill chuckled. "They're impressive. I still remember the first time I saw them as a new lieutenant. Made me proud to wear the same uniform, even if I never mastered spinning a rifle without dropping it on my foot." As he prepared for the evening's events, selecting the civilian formal wear appropriate for the dinner rather than his already worn dress blues, Bill considered the journey ahead. The Veterans Dignity Initiative would require sustained attention to fulfill its promise. The systems being created would need refinement, the training programs would require monitoring, and the cultural shifts necessary for true change would develop slowly, despite the high-profile launch. But for the first time in decades, there was a national conversation happening about how America treated its aging veterans, not just in terms of health care and benefits, but in the daily interactions that defined their experience as citizens of the nation they had served. That conversation, regardless of the political winds that might affect specific programs, represented progress that couldn't be easily reversed. The evening at the Marine Barracks unfolded with the precision and ceremony characteristic of Corps events. The silent drill platoon's performance drew gasps of appreciation from the audience, including Michael, whose eyes never left the intricate maneuvers of the 24 Marines executing their routine without verbal commands. During dinner, Bill found himself seated beside the current Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, a position he had always considered the true backbone of the service. The conversation flowed easily between them, bridging the decades that separated. Their active service but highlighting the continuity of the Corps' values and challenges. The youngsters joining today are different, the sergeant major observed. More technologically savvy, asking more questions about the why behind orders. But when it comes to the core of what makes a Marine, the willingness to put mission and comrades above self, that hasn't changed a bit. Bill nodded. Each generation serves in its own way, with its own strengths. Our job as the old guard is to transmit the essential while making room for the evolution. As coffee and dessert were served, the commandant rose to offer a toast. To Colonel William Anderson, he began, raising his glass, whose distinguished service continues long after the uniform was folded away. Your example reminds us that once a Marine, always a Marine, not just in title, but in the continued commitment to Corps' values in every arena of life. The assembled Marines rose as one, glasses lifted. Colonel Anderson, they intoned in unison. Bill acknowledged the toast with a nod, deeply moved by this recognition from the service that had shaped his life so profoundly. As he looked around, the room at Marines of all ages, from the fresh-faced lieutenants just beginning their careers to the grizzled veterans of conflicts spanning decades, he felt the powerful continuity of the Corps, the unbroken line of service and sacrifice that stretched back nearly 250 years. After dinner, as the formal program concluded and guests began to mingle, Bill found a quiet moment with Michael, who had been unusually thoughtful all evening. "Penny for your thoughts, son," he offered, easing himself onto a bench in the barracks. Historic courtyard. Michael sat beside him, his lanky teenage frame still awkward with growth, but beginning to show the man he would become. "Grandpa, I've been thinking about joining up after graduation." Bill nodded, unsurprised. The boy had been moving in this direction for months, his interest in military history and traditions deepening, his questions about Bill's service becoming more specific and thoughtful. "Your mother mentioned you might be considering that path," Bill said carefully. "It's an honorable choice, but not one to make lightly." "I know," Michael replied seriously. "It's not about the uniform or the cool equipment. It's about being part of something important, something bigger than yourself." He paused, formulating his thoughts. "Seeing how all these Marines respect you, not just for what you did 50 years ago, but for who you are now. That's the kind of legacy I'd like to build." Bill studied his grandson's face, seeing in it the same earnest determination Claire had shown when she'd announced her own intention to serve decades earlier. "The Corps would be fortunate to have you, Michael. But remember, the uniform isn't what makes the Marine. It's the values you carry, in or out of service." Michael nodded. "Like what you did after Atlanta. You could have just been angry about how you were treated, but instead you turned it into something positive for other veterans. That's what I want to learn, how to take challenges and make them matter." The wisdom in the boy's observation struck Bill deeply. Michael had articulated something essential about service that many never grasped, that its true value lay not in the dramatic moments of heroism, though those mattered, but in the consistent choice to transform difficulty into opportunity, to find meaning in challenge. "You're already learning it," Bill told him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And whatever path you choose, military or civilian, that understanding will serve you well." Their conversation was interrupted by Claire, who approached with Rebecca in tow. "Dad, Michael, we should think about heading back to the hotel. It's getting late, and we have an early flight tomorrow." Bill nodded, using his cane to push himself upright. The day's activities had taken their toll, and the flight back to Dallas tomorrow would require reserves of energy he needed to conserve. As they walked toward the waiting car, Rebecca fell into step beside Bill. "Colonel Anderson," she began hesitantly, "I wanted to thank you again for including me in all of this. 6 months ago, I was lost, angry, feeling like my father's service and struggles meant nothing to anyone outside our family. Now, Now you're ensuring other families don't face those struggles alone, Bill finished for her. Your father would be proud, Rebecca. Not just of the work you're doing, but of the strength you've shown in transforming your pain into purpose. Her eyes glistened in the evening light. That's what you did, isn't it? After Vietnam, after your injuries, you kept finding ways to serve, to make meaning from difficulty. Bill considered this as they reached the car. I suppose I did, though it wasn't always conscious. Martha helped. She had a way of seeing purpose when I could only see problems. And the Corps provided a framework, a continued sense of belonging even after active service ended. That's what I've found through this work, Rebecca said quietly. A sense of belonging again, of continuing my father's legacy in a different way than I had imagined. The drive back to the hotel was subdued, everyone processing the events of this landmark day in their own way. Emma had long since fallen, asleep in her car seat, exhausted by the excitement and attention. Claire and Robert spoke quietly about logistical details for their return to Dallas. Michael gazed out the window at the Washington monuments illuminated against the night sky, his thoughts clearly far away. Bill watched his family, this living legacy more meaningful to him than any policy or program bearing his name. The true measure of a life, he had long believed, was not found in accolades or achievements, but in the values transmitted to the next generation, in the examples set through daily choices both large and small. The Anderson Protocol would help thousands of veterans navigate systems with greater dignity. The Veterans Service Offices, being established at airports nationwide, would provide practical assistance to those facing mobility challenges. The training programs would sensitize personnel to the unique needs of aging or disabled service members. All of these were significant, worthy accomplishments that had emerged from that morning in Atlanta when a security guard had deemed him too old and frail to travel independently. But as Bill observed Michael's thoughtful expression, Rebecca's newfound purpose, and Claire's continued embodiment of the leadership principles he had tried to instill, he recognized the deeper legacy, the transmission of values that would long outlast any policy or program. Back at the hotel, as the family prepared for sleep, Bill took a moment on the balcony of his suite, gazing out at the capital city glittering below. Washington had changed dramatically since his first posting. Here as a young officer, the skyline transformed, the political landscape repeatedly redrawn. But the fundamental promise of America, the ideals he had sworn to defend, remained constant despite the nation's ongoing struggles to fully realize them. His phone buzzed with a message from General Harrington. News just in: Atlanta International has completed its Veterans Service Office 3 months ahead of schedule. They're requesting you cut the ribbon next month. Poetic justice? Bill smiled at the symmetry. From humiliation to honor in the same location, a full circle that represented not just his personal journey, but the potential for institutional change when the right pressures were applied at the right moments. He typed a brief reply: "Tell them I'll be there. Traveling alone, of course." Returning inside, Bill prepared for bed with the methodical routine he had maintained for decades. As he placed his prosthetic limbs carefully aside and settled under the covers, he thought of the day's events, the White House ceremony, the Marine Barracks dinner, the quiet conversations that had mattered most amidst the public recognition. Sleep came quickly, but just before consciousness faded, Bill had a final thought that brought a smile to his lips. Martha had been right all those years ago when she'd told him his most important service might come after the uniform was put away. As usual, his wise wife had seen further down the road than he could. In the morning, Colonel William Anderson would board a plane back to Dallas, accompanied by his family but traveling under his own authority, a decorated veteran whose age and physical limitations were recognized not as disqualifications for independence, but as testaments to a lifetime of service and sacrifice. And somewhere in the Atlanta airport, a group of TSA agents would be completing a newly mandated training session on the Anderson Protocol. learning to see beyond canes and wheelchairs to the individuals who had earned the right to be treated with dignity, regardless of age or ability. Because sometimes it takes the silencing of an entire airport terminal, the unexpected appearance of authority figures, the public recognition of private worth, to remind a forgetful world that those who sacrificed for freedom should never be denied the dignity of exercising it. In the quiet of his hotel room, Bill Anderson slept peacefully, his day's mission complete, his legacy secure not just in programs and protocols, but in the lives he had touched and the values he had transmitted, a continuum of service that would extend far beyond his own journey. The measure of a life, after all, is found not in its duration, but in its donation. And by that standard, Colonel William Anderson's cup had long since overflowed, creating ripples that would continue to spread long after his own journey ended, touching shores he would never see, but had helped to secure for generations yet to come. If you believe that those who sacrifice their mobility for our freedom deserve respect, not rejection, type honor in the comments below. And remember, sometimes true strength is found not in the absence of weakness, but in the dignity with which we navigate life's challenges, a lesson Colonel William Anderson had embodied throughout his remarkable journey from battlefield to White House, from combat leader to elder statesman, from decorated hero to beloved great-grandfather. Some missions continue long after the uniform is folded away. Some soldiers never stop serving. And some battles, like the fight for dignity, require not weapons but wisdom, not aggression but advocacy, not fury but the quiet, unyielding determination of those who understand that respect is not a privilege to be granted or withheld, but a right earned through service and sacrifice. In the silent terminal of that Atlanta morning, when boots echoed on tile and a general rendered a perfect salute to a seated veteran, a simple truth had been demonstrated for all to witness. True honor lies not in perfect bodies or youthful vigor, but in the character forged through challenge and the dignity maintained despite difficulty. A lesson worth remembering, a legacy worth preserving, a story worth telling. Colonel William Anderson's story, America's story, our story. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us